to RGES World Literature. This is Lesson 31, one of our two different topics this week, and this will be on writing. We'll actually be looking at the narrative essay. Now we're going to begin with the scripture from 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 through 10. And it says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." Now, this is a great exhortation from the scripture, and I don't think I have to tell you that desire for wealth and desire for material possessions is a great pull. It is a great lure for many people. In fact, I would say it motivates a great deal of day-to-day life, energy, preoccupation emotionally and mentally for many people. And so the scripture warns us that we want to guard our hearts against a love of money. Living that way will not produce contentment. Okay, so we want to live with our focus on the Lord, on His kingdom, on what He desires, on what we would say is the first commandment. What's the first commandment? Loving the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving others as yourself. That ought to be the focus and direction of our lives. Having things is not in and of itself a sin. Being wealthy is not of itself a sin, but a desire to continuously increase our wealth as though that gives happiness is a folly. It's a terrible way to live one's life, and it only generates not contentment but discontent. Well, we are going to be looking at a short story today by Leo Tolstoy. We're going to look at a couple. I'll look at one, and then you'll look at one at home. And this one is called Ilias. And if you want to read along, which I would recommend that you do, I want you to go to a website, the Literature Network, www.online-literature.com, and look up the short story Ilias by Leo Tolstoy. So hopefully you have come back and you've printed this out in hard copy form if you desired, or maybe you're just sitting at your computer and you can read along. Now normally if we were in class I would be having you read and taking sections, but this time I'll have to read it all. If you notice when you print out the Literature Network version, we have ILY ?S, and that's because the A with the accent over it doesn't print out in this website, and so you're going to get that little funny throughout. Every time his name is, you're going to have that little triangle with the question mark. Don't worry about it, just read Ilias. Now notice when we have a short story, as we do here, the punctuation for a novel, which we've been reading all year, is the italics or the underlined. But the punctuation for a short story is always quotes. So that's something you should know as a high school literature student. Now, when we talk about a short story differs from a novel. There are several ways it differs, and they're probably rather obvious to you. One, the plot must be simple. In other words, it's not going to be a very convoluted, complex plot. Think of both your examples as far as the Count of Monte Cristo that we have read, very elaborate plot, and Les Miserables, very, very elaborate plot. So you can't do that in a short story because a short story is only going to be between a few pages to perhaps a couple dozen pages. It is not long enough to develop a complicated plot, so the plot will be simple. The second thing I want you to notice in a short story is that the story, because you don't have many pages to get the job done, the short story begins quickly. In other words, the story itself, you jump right in. An author does not have time to slowly build up an elaborate setting and background. Number 3 is you have usually a single theme that is the focus of the story. Again, when I ask you to write themes for a book like Count of Monte Cristo, we could fill up the board with theme suggestions. Some are stronger than others. Some are more pervasive in the novel. We have major themes and more minor themes, but we have lots of different lessons that one can draw from the story and that the author is pointing us to. This is definitely true of Les Miserables in addition. But in a short story, you typically have one theme. So you're not looking for little themes, for nuanced ideas, for extra lessons. We are looking for the theme that drives the story. The last idea that I would talk about is that typically in a novel, many things can drive the theme, but I would say a lot character drives the theme. I don't think that's quite as true, generally speaking, with a short story. I would say the plot lays out the theme. In a short story, usually character develops more of our themes in a novel. So that's just by observation. I've never actually seen anybody ever teach that, but that is typically my impression as I read short stories. Now, what we're going to do now is I am going to just simply read the story to you, and you could just listen or you could read along. Ilias by Leo Tolstoy. There once lived in the government of I'm not sure because I'm getting my writing messed up too on this, a Bashkir named Ilias. His father, who died a year after he had found his son a wife, did not leave him much property. Ilias then had only 7 mares, 2 cows, and about a score of sheep. He was a good manager, however, and soon began to acquire more. He and his wife worked from morn till night, rising earlier than others and going later to bed, and his possessions increased year by year. Living in this way, Ilias, little by little, acquired great wealth. At the end of 35 years, he had 200 horses, 150 head of cattle, and 1,200 sheep. Hired laborers tended his flocks and herds, and hired women milked his mares and cows and made kumis, which is a fermented drink made from mare's milk, butter, and cheese. Ilias had abundance of everything, and everyone in the district envied him. They said of him, "Ilias is a fortunate man. He has plenty of everything. This world must be a pleasant place for him." People of position heard of Ilias and sought his acquaintance. Visitors came to him from afar, and he welcomed everyone and gave them food and drink. Whoever might come, there was always kumis, tea, sherbet, and mutton to set before them. Whenever visitors arrived, a sheep would be killed, or sometimes 2. And if many guests came, he would even slaughter a mare for them. Ilias had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and he married them all off. While he was poor, his sons worked with him, and looked after the flocks and herds themselves. But when he grew rich, they got spoiled, and one of them took to drink. The eldest was killed in a brawl, and the younger, who had married a self-willed woman, ceased to obey his father, and they could not live together any more. So they parted, and Ilias gave his son a house and some of the cattle, and this diminished his wealth. Soon after that, a disease broke out among Ilias' sheep, and many died. Then followed a bad harvest, and the hay crop failed, and many cattle died that winter. Then the Kumis, again, difficult to read the name, captured his best herd of horses, and Ilias' property dwindled away. It became smaller and smaller, while at the same time his strength grew less, till by the time he was 70 years old, he had begun to sell his furs, carpets, saddles, and tents. At last he had to part with his remaining cattle, and found himself face to face with want. Want meaning poverty. Before he knew how it had happened, he had lost everything, and in their old age he and his wife had to go into service. Ilias had nothing left, except the clothes on his back, a fur cloak, a cup, his indoor shoes and overshoes, and his wife, Shamshimagi, who also was old by this time. The son who had parted from him had gone into a far country, and his daughter was dead. So there was no one to help the old couple. Their neighbor, Mohammed Shah, took pity on them. Mohammed Shah was neither rich nor poor, but lived comfortably and was a good man. He remembered Ilias' hospitality, and pitying him, said, "Come and live with me, Ilias, you and your old woman. In summer, you can work in my melon garden as much as your strength allows, and in winter feed my cattle. And Shamshimagi shall milk my mares and make kumis. I will feed and clothe you both. When you need anything, tell me, and you shall have it." Ilias thanked his neighbor, and he and his wife took service with Mohammed Shah as laborers. At first the position seemed hard to them, but they got used to it and lived on, working as much as their strength allowed. Mohammed Shah found it was to his advantage to keep such people, because having been masters themselves, they knew how to manage and were not lazy, but did all the work they could. Yet it grieved Mohammed Shah to see people brought so low who had been of such high standing. It happened once that some of Mohammed Shah's relatives came from a great distance to visit him, and a mullah came too. Now, a mullah would be like a great teacher among the Muhammads. So Mohammed Shah told Ilias to catch a sheep and kill it. Ilias skinned the sheep and boiled it and sent it to the guests. The guests ate the mutton, had some tea, and then began drinking kumis. As they were sitting with their host on down cushions on a carpet, conversing and sipping kumis from their cups, Ilias, having finished his work, passed by the open door. Mohammed Shah, seeing him pass, said to one of the guests, "Did you notice that old man who passed just now?" "Yes," said the visitor. "What is there remarkable about him?" "Only this, that he was once the richest man among us," replied the host. "His name is Ilias. You may have heard of him." "Of course I have heard of him," the guest replied. "Of course I have heard of him," the guest answered. "I never saw him before, but his fame has spread far and wide." "Yes, and now he has nothing left," said Mohammed Shah, "and he lives with me as my laborer, and his old woman is here too. She milks the mares." The guest was astonished. He clicked with his tongue, shook his head, and said, "Fortune turns like a wheel. One man it lifts, another it sets down. Does not the old man grieve over all he has lost?" "Who can tell? He lives quietly and peacefully and works well." "May I speak to him?" asked the guest. "I should like to ask him about his life." Why not? Replied the master, and he called from the kipitka, a movable tent, in which they were dwelling, Baba, which in the Bashkir tongue means grandfather. Come in and have a cup of Kumis with us, and call your wife here also. Ilias entered with his wife, and after exchanging greetings with his master and the guests, he repeated a prayer and seated himself near the door. His wife passed in behind the curtain and sat with her mistress. A cup of Kumis was handed to Ilias. He wished the guests and his master good health, bowed, drank a little, and put down the cup. Well, Dad, said the guest, who had wished to speak with him, I suppose you feel rather sad at the sight of us. It must remind you of your former prosperity and of your present sorrows. Ilias smiled and said, If I were to tell you what is happiness and what is misfortune, you would not believe me. You had better ask my wife. She is a woman, and what is in her heart is on her tongue. She will tell you the whole truth. The guest turned towards the curtain. Well, Granny, he cried, tell me how your former happiness compares with your present misfortune. And Shamshimagi answered from behind the curtain. This is what I think about it. My old man and I lived for 50 years seeking happiness and not finding it. And it is only now, these last 2 years, since we had nothing left and have lived as laborers, that we have found real happiness, and we wish for nothing better than our present lot. The guests were astonished, and so was the master. He even rose and drew the curtain back, so as to see the old woman's face. There she stood with her arms folded, looking at her old husband and smiling. And he smiled back at her. The old woman went on. I speak the truth and do not jest. For half a century we sought for happiness, and as long as we were rich we never found it. Now that we have nothing left and have taken service as laborers, we have found such happiness that we want nothing better. But in what does your happiness consist? Asked the guest. Why, in this, she replied. When we were rich, my husband and I had so many cares that we had no time to talk to one another, or to think of our souls, or to pray to God. Now we had visitors, and had to consider what food to set before them and what presents to give them, lest they should speak ill of us. When they left, we had to look after our laborers, who were always trying to shirk work and get the best food, while we wanted to get all we could out of them. So we sinned. Then we were in fear lest a wolf should kill a foal, or a calf, or a calf, or thieves steal our horses. We lay awake at night, worrying lest the ewes should overlie their lambs, and we got up again and again to see that all was well. One thing attended it to, another care would spring up. How, for instance, to get enough fodder for the winter. And besides that, my old man and I used to disagree. He would say we must do so and so, and I would differ from him, and then we disputed, sinning again. So we passed from one trouble to another, from one sin to another, and found no happiness. Well, and then? Now, when my husband and I wake in the morning, we always have a loving word for one another, and we live peacefully, having nothing to quarrel about. We have no care but how best to serve our master. We work as much as our strength allows and do it with a will, that our master may not lose but profit by us. When we come in, dinner or supper is ready, and there is kumis to drink. We have fuel to burn when it is cold, and we have our fur cloak. And we have time to talk, time to think of our souls, and time to pray. For 50 years we sought happiness, but only now at last have we found it. The guests laughed, but Ilias said, Do not laugh, my friends. It is not a matter for jesting. It is the truth of life. We also were foolish at first and wept at the loss of our wealth. But now God has shown us the truth, and we tell it, not for our own consolation, but for your good. And the mullah said, that is a wise speech. Ilias has spoken the exact truth. The same is said in Holy Writ. And the guests ceased laughing and became thoughtful. Now, one of the first things I think you notice is the contrast between a short story and a longer work here, in the sense that it is told, some are surprising, some are a little more complex, but basically it is a simple story. Okay. And so where does the meaning and the satisfaction come from in reading a short story? It is poignant. It makes a point very quickly, and it leaves you to reflect on it. Sometimes it is shocking or surprising. At different times we will read other short stories in our other literature classes, and I think of somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, or a mystery or a detective story that will draw to a very quick and shocking conclusion. But regardless, a short story must make its point in a very few pages. It teaches one to be succinct, to get to the point, as they say, get to the main idea. So now we are going to stop this and go to part 2 on a new tape of the writing section of Lesson 31, where we are going to teach you what it would mean to write a narrative essay based upon a short story.